there, art nerds. Today we are talking about Paul Rubens watercolors again. Today we have their G4 tubes. They come in this nice matte finish cardboard box. Inside are our tubins. And I was so impressed with so many of my experiences with Paul Rubens products that I did it again. I wanted to see if the G4 watercolors are truly better than their older watercolor tubes, compare these against their G4 half pans, and actually start digging into the pigment. So this is a pretty long one. We get pretty in-depth, and I believe that this review may answer questions that the other Paul Rubens reviews that I've seen online dance around. So as someone who has reviewed several different Paul Rubens products, I can actually tell you guys if these are worth buying, if these are worth their money, and if they are truly an improvement on older Paul Rubens tubes. I am so excited to talk to you guys about this set today. Hello there, art nerds. We are about to spend a lot of time talking about Paul Rubens. We have the solid watercolor. We have the newer tube watercolors, which are supposed to be an improvement on the old ones. And I really like the old ones, so I'm really looking forward to seeing how they've improved them. We have the classical art, and these are kind of like Kuretake Gensai Tambe pans in terms of format, and we have their opaque watercolor. Don't worry, we're not doing all four of these in one video. That would be ridiculous. I'm going to break this up into 4 separate videos, but I wanted to give you guys an idea of what to look forward to. Today, we're going to be talking about the artist watercolors. I purchased these on Amazon, and I'm going to show you what the current listing is going for. I believe I purchased these either on Prime Day or on Black Friday, so I did not pay full price for these. So my goals for today are to unbox these. We are going to swatch them while they're still wet. Then I'm going to set them up in half pans and let them dry out to test their reconstitutionability. Now, I really like my other set of Paul Rubens watercolors, so I may also bring those out and do some comparative swatching so we can see how the two compare. I am open-minded that these can actually be better than the other ones, but the other ones were pretty dang good, and they are a lot of fun to paint with. And it was the set that came with the little pink palette with like the Stay Fresh watercolors, so like that's a hard one to beat, y'all. So today is going to be interesting. This box came shrink wrapped, and it's a pretty classy matte cardboard box. My passion comes from the heavens, not from earthly musings. We have 24 colors in 5 milliliter tubes. On the back, we have a little bit of information, but not too much. Now for the reveal. Inside, we have a little brochure. Ooh, this is hard to read. So this is our pigment information, our opacity information, our light fastness information for all of these colors. We have a lot of single pigment colors, but we also have several 2 and 3 pigment colors. Well, yes, pigment colors. There's a space in there. Pigment colors, not pigment colors, not color of the pigment. So this also comes in 5 milliliter, which is what we have today, 15 milliliter and 60 milliliter tubes for those of us who paint a lot. And oh, such tiny print in so many different languages. All right, I went and fetched my glasses, not that you guys can see. These are also the 4th generation paints. which I also have here in half pans. And that's a funny story. And you guys should watch the review of these against their cheaper goosey-eyed counterparts. Talk about that a little bit more. But this will also provide some useful information. Which of these are a better option for someone who likes to paint from half pans like I do? Is it better to just have the half pan straight out? Is it more economical to get them from tubes? And are these the same colors? Could I actually refill my half pans with the tubes from this set? Basically, kind of having the best of both worlds. So that will be interesting to try and answer. So hopefully this will provide a little more information than the half pans booklet did. But I think it's a lot of the same stuff, just in different languages. So this print is tiny. Earlier, the pigments used by Chinese painting artists were basically imported. On the one hand, there were price and channel restrictions, and on the other hand, the product types and quality were uneven. Most painting artists sometimes needed to make their own pigments that meet their needs. Faced with the pain points of the industry, Eugene Hang, okay, so that's a name, not you, comma, all right, Jin Hai, sorry, who has been engaged in the painting material industry for many years, is determined to make changes for this. Earlier, the pigments used by Chinese painting artists were basically imported. Oh, okay, so these two paragraphs are the exact same thing. Today, Rubens, as a self-developed national paint brand, has been praised by many users. Behind the applause, the Rubens brand insists on the simple values of achieving artistic beauty. In the future, Rubens will continue to uphold the awe and innovation of the industry and make unremitting efforts to better serve users. The 4th generation artist quality watercolor paint set. Paul Rubens watercolor paint set comes with 115 colors, 76 of which were made from single pigments, providing you with the flexibility to mix colors in a way that is clean and pure. Our watercolor paints are available in both solid pans and tubes, as well as in 2 distinct varieties to accommodate the needs of different painting techniques. These paints may either include or be free of oxgall. Colloids. The gum arabic that goes into the production of our watercolor paints is clear and soluble in water, and it comes from the southern part of the Sahara. Multiple tests have been conducted on the solubility of each pigment to ensure they play along with other paints and produce quality results in the artistic endeavor. Selected pigments. Durable pigments are what Paul Rubens prefers to use instead of less expensive ones. In this case, PV1 and PV3 are never substituted for PV14 in the process of producing a shade of purple. The cost of PV1 and PV3 is just 1/50th of that of PV14, PW6, PB29, and PB15 are not used in the formulation of PB28 Cobalt Blue, since they cost 1/50th as much. You will thus discover that our watercolor paints are equal to those of well-known brands in terms of the effects they produce and the colors that they come in. So I think what they're trying to say is that they only try to use high-quality pigments, which make them comparable with popular, well-known watercolor brands. High-purity pigments. The pigments we use in our production are only of high purity with no fillers added to alter their properties. Therefore, Paul Rubens watercolor paints are ideal for painting both wet and dry and will not change color or become gray when used in either state. Fine grinding and filling. Paul Rubens professional watercolor paint is composed of finely ground pigment materials. To guarantee a high degree of color finesse or fineness, the pigments have been ground again after 2 months of thorough fusion. Multiple filling processes have been applied to the solid watercolor paints so that each filling may be fully dried out. Paints are packaged in durable, double-layered, inner boxes so they may be filled to capacity and the pigments can be protected more effectively. And since I have used Google Translate on a lot of this stuff in the past, I'm not going to translate it again. So underneath are our 5 milliliter tubes. And they are little metal tubes, not ointment tubes and not plastic tubes. And they look like that. Next, it is time to decant these tubes into half pans and go ahead and swatch them. Then I will set this aside for a week so it can fully dry out and we'll swatch them again. Buying empty palettes online is kind of expensive, so what I decided to do instead was I bought a box of these tins off of Amazon. And since I already have and buy my half pans in bulk, I can just tape, magnet, whatever, them in place. And I thought this would work well and be a little bit cheaper. It's going to have a smaller sort of profile style. And if I like this method, then when I decide to start adding some new art kits to my lineup, this might be a direction that I decide to go in, because I may be able to offer a wider variety of paints in a palette this size. This is a little bit small. Actually, you could also use this as a pencil tin. So if you wanted to make like a DIY watercolor palette that has more streamlined format, this could actually work quite well. Payment information will be in the show notes down below, and I also have a spreadsheet that contains my Paul Rubens pigment, light, fast, and opacity information compared against other Paul Rubens, and that is a Patreon exclusive, and I'll link that down for you guys as well. The colors in this set are Naples yellow, lemon yellow, cadmium yellow, chromium yellow hue deep, chromium orange hue, cadmium red light, perylene maroon, quinacridone rose, quinacridone maroon, dioxazine violet, indigo, French blue, Berlin blue, phthalo blue, translucent turquoise, oriental green, May green, cobalt turquoise dark, olive green dark, earth yellow, burnt sienna, Venetian red, brown umber, and ivory black. Each pour, and the half pans are not totally full, is about half the tube. These are going to dry lower as they evaporate as well. So for the most part, these tubes are very liquidy. There's a few exceptions, and a few kind of sputtered when they were coming out of the tube, but in general, pretty liquidy. Also, each not quite full pour took up about half of these tubes. These are on the smaller side, so you can probably fill either a whole pan per tube with maybe a little left over, or maybe you can fill 2 half pans with each tube. And as these dry, they are going to kind of go lower. So if you wanted like a really good full pour, then you would want to top it up before calling it done. So next we are going to do our wet swatches. We're going to swatch on our Blick Studio watercolor paper. Then I'm going to let these dry for a week before we move on to further testing. So just a reminder that reviews like this are made possible thanks to the support of my patrons on Patreon. I use the money from Patreon to replenish consumables like the Blick Studio watercolor paper here, and I also use it to purchase the watercolor supplies that I review here on the channel. So if you like the work that I do and you can afford to join me on Patreon, you will get early access to videos like this, and you'll also get backer exclusive access to the class material that I create when I'm teaching classes, as well as access to free printable line arts on the regular. And you can find me at patreon.com/NettoSoup. For the wet swatching, I noticed that just one of the colors had a lot of separation, and while I tried to dab it up and soak up as much as possible, it's still affecting my ability to swatch that particular color. I always seem to struggle with color control when working straight from the tube. I tend to pick up too much paint, so I figured these are going to be much easier to handle once they've had a chance to dry out some. These have some opacity and coverage to them, even in this really diluted form, and that makes sense. The tubes were a lot of semi-transparent, semi-opaque, and opaque colors. So once I finished swatching all 24 of these, I allowed them to dry out for a week. It's been at least a week since I poured these half pans. They are plenty dry because it has been very dry out here. I think it's time to re-swatch them and see how they activate. I went ahead and pre-activated these to give them the best chance of swatching. And one of the first things I have to say is what the heck is up with this Naples yellow? It didn't swatch well from the tube and it doesn't reactivate like at all. In general, colors are maybe easier to handle than they were straight from the tube. Some do appear to be more saturated and it's a little bit easier to handle color. These were a little bit easier to handle once they'd been dried out in half pans than they were straight from the tubes, although I do not know what is going on with that Naples yellow. I've also noticed there's some interesting differences between this palette and their G4 half pans, and we're going to talk about that in more depth in a little bit. But next, it's time for some color mixing. For color mixing, surprisingly, I don't have any notes, so I'm just going to kind of walk you guys through my process. I'm trying to mix some secondary colors that, yes, some of these colors are technically available, but I do want to see how well you can mix up custom colors. So I am doing the warm yellow, warm red, warm blue, cool red sort of mixing to get a variety of secondary colors, aiming for oranges, greens, purples. I'm also going to mix blue with a burnt sienna or a burnt umber to achieve a Payne's gray. And then if there's still space, any interesting color mixes that might come to mind. So something I've noticed about these particular paints is they have a bit of opacity to them that I wasn't really expecting. They're a little bit muddier, a little bit murkier than I really expected from Paul Rubens, especially given my past experiences with their tube paints. Now, some of the mixes are really pretty, and I definitely want to continue to put these through their paces to really kind of suss them out. But right now, I'm not really seeing a reason to upgrade from your existing Paul Rubens palettes if you happen to have them to their G4 palettes, or to pay the additional money for their G4 palettes. But I also want to remind you guys that I do watercolor illustration and watercolor comics like these. I do a lot of layers in my work. I do a lot of glazing in my work. I do a lot of color mixing in my work. So that's the lens that I'm viewing this from. If you do a different kind of watercolor, if you do landscapes or abstracts or florals, you may feel very differently about these properties. So I'm just sharing my findings with you guys, and you guys can decide what works best for you. I didn't really have any notes for the wet into wet test either. I ended up switching over to a separate block of cotton rag because I had run out of room on my swatch page. So we're still using the Blick Studio. I saturate the page with water, and then I just start picking colors and loosely applying them to the very wet paper and just kind of see how they blend out, how they mix together. I am looking for like hard lines, hard edges, white halos, colors not really intermixing, maybe just staying too much in one place on the paper. I did notice though that as it dried, the colors did shift and move around fairly significantly. So as this dried, I noticed that a lot of the colors lightened up and really diffused on the cotton rag paper. So these could be a really good option if you like to do misty, atmospheric wet and wet. That said, I noticed that the first time I had tried Paul Rubens tube watercolors years ago. So I can't necessarily say that these are really an improvement on the older paints, but it will be interesting to compare these against some of the older paints as well as against the pigments used. Now, that said, the set that I have of the older tubes is not like a basic 24 set. I believe it's like, well, I'll grab it and show you guys in a minute. So I don't expect it to be a perfect one-to-one, but it will be interesting to kind of compare how the paints handle. Before I get into that though, I want to do the lift test. Really strangely for me, I don't really have any notes for the lift test, so it was probably a pretty standard lift test. Some colors are going to be more lifting than others. Some are going to be more staining, and that's what you expect to see with watercolors. I did find that the From half pans were a little bit easier to lift up, but that makes sense because those were more freshly applied. But I wasn't really able to get any full lifting. So these are the Paul Rubens tubes that I'm going to be comparing these against. My mom gave me this set for Christmas a few years ago, and I really kind of fell in love. I fell in love with how the paint's handled. I fell in love with the color selection. Now, this is a gift set in that it came with this palette as well as the tubes. The tubes are smaller 8 milliliter tubes, but what's really neat about this palette, let me see if I can pry it out for you guys, is the Magello-esque watercolor palette. And mine has been used. It's seen quite a bit of love. You guys can see the little key shape for prying out the bottom thing so that you can clean it or use it for extra mixing space. We have a little bit of space here. You could put like a tube of white gouache, and mine is pretty dirty and it definitely needs some refilling, but that's because this is a palette that I like and that I enjoy using. So I was really hoping the G4, the new and improved, would be like this, but even better. And we can already see that there's quite a few color differences between the two palettes, but I want to swatch it for you guys. I'm going to swatch from this palette here rather than the tubes. And I just want to remind you guys, I have a spreadsheet that is compiling all of the Paul Rubens watercolors that I currently own. It's got the pigment information when available. It's got the name. It's got the light fastness. It's got the opacity, all that information. And I am sharing that with my patrons. So if you like what I do, you want to help me continue to do it, and you'd like access to that spreadsheet, you can join me on patreon.com/natosoup. We're going to start by re-swatching the new tubes. With a lot of scrubbing and pumping, I can get Naples Yellow to activate and apply color. Why is this color so challenging? Are the older tubes. I'm going to spritz them to pre-activate them, and we are just going to swatch them in order. I like the color selection in this palette better. There's a lot of fun colors like an opera rose and a vertiver blue and also a turquoise blue and the light green that add whimsy to the color selection, and were removed from the G4 palette, and I don't really understand why. The new tubes are 5 milliliter tubes. The older tubes are 8 milliliter tubes, so they contain a little bit more paint. And just in general, I like the format better. And yeah, I did pick the half pans for this format, but I really do like the Paul Rubens wide horizontal swatch areas. It just works really well, and it would suit larger brushes as well as smaller brushes. And it can hold a fair amount of paint, and it's just easier to work with than a lot of palettes I found. I might be biased, but I actually like the old palette better than the newer palette. There are some really fun colors in this palette. I love some of the granulation and some of the effects. And of course, the fact that it came with this kind of palette, which is really easy to use and it's very easy to get your brush in there, didn't hurt at all. Of course, it also helps that this was a present and like it has some really fond sentimental memories for me. But I do think I still prefer this version of the tubes than their newer formulation of the tubes, and I'm really kind of curious why they decided to reformulate after all. However, I have one more test that I want to do with you guys. I actually have some of the G4 half pans, and I'd like to do a head-to-head swatch off between the tubes and their half pans. So here is the G4 solid watercolor half pans. I fully reviewed these in another review, so I hope you guys will check that out. But I did want to compare them against the tubes. I'm going to have the prices over here for the half pans and over here for the tubes for you guys. They come in a black metal palette with a swatch card and with the half pans already provided. And in terms of colors, I think we can see some similarities and we can see some differences, but I'm excited to see how they all swatch out. I'm going to start with the new half pans. I spritzed with water to activate. This set includes a white, and the colors activated quickly and readily. Now, if you watched my G4 half pans review, where we also talked about the Caime paint, I basically said I don't really think these are an improvement over the older half pans, that I happen to like the older half pans very well. And if you already have that set, you don't need the new set, and you may be able to save a little bit of money buying the older set instead of this newer set. Also, for the half pans, I believe they contain more single pigment colors. The older set contains more single pigment colors than the newer set, but I might be confusing that with the G4 tubes. However, like I mentioned earlier, I have a spreadsheet where I compare all of this, and if you're a patron, you can find out for yourself. The G4 tubes get soupy if you let water sit on them, and that's not really surprising. These would probably do better in the Mugello style palette that the older tubes came with. Palettes have different colors, which I think I commented on earlier, but I do find it strange. Why wouldn't it be the same color palette and the same pigment, just in two different formats, half pans versus tubes? There's no exterior indication to imply that they are different palettes or for different kinds of artists. So since these are different colors, there's going to be different pigments used and different opacities. This also means it's more challenging to fill your half pans that you already own from these tubes. The tube indigo reactivates better than the half pan. The tube Prussian blue reactivates better than the half pan as well. I prefer the older PR pans and tubes to their newer G4 versions. So over here we have the G4 half pans. Over here we have the G4 tubes. In general, I think I prefer both the older Paul Rubens pans and tubes to their G4 versions. I really don't get why they reformulated. If any of you guys know the skinny on that, please do let me know. And if you prefer the new versions to the old versions, let me know that as well. I'd be curious to hear what you think of them, how your experiences differ from mine, etc. I do think, though, that I prefer the G4 tubes over the G4 half pans, but I am seeing a little bit of scaling when it comes to some of the colors with the tubes, like the black and the sepia have some scaling. So I am kind of on the fence about whether or not I want to do a field test with these. I'm not going to field test both of these. They're too similar. I think if I do a field test, I will go ahead and do it with from the tubes, because I do like those just a little bit better. And you guys will see from this video if I do a field test or not, because the field test will be following here. Help me prepare for the field test. I'm creating a little color map of each half pan, and I'm using Bao Hang cotton rag watercolor paper for this. And this is just kind of a handy reference for me as I use this palette to paint the field test, so I'm not trying to guess what color is which. This illustration was originally from Lilliputian Living 2023, and that was my fashion sort of a year, my fashion challenge, where I just depicted different Lilliputian fashions and how they make their clothing and what kind of clothing they wear in different environments throughout the year. So this would be winter and she's feeding a sparrow. For the background, I wanted to kind of mix Payne's gray up, so I used the ultramarine blue and some burnt sienna to create kind of a moody, more wintry background sky. I am referencing the sparrow from several different photographs of sparrows because I want it to be recognizable. I want it to look like what it looks like. The colors I decided to go for this are a dark green jumpsuit, a brown sparrow, white cups with gray handles, brown and black on the sparrow, snow in the background, no dirt, just cast shadows under the seeds, maybe a red hat, brown or blonde hair, brown agouti fur on the cuffs and the collar, and brownish black boots is kind of what I was thinking at the time. And this is being painted on Arches cotton rag paper, and I inked this with a Sakura Pigma FB brush pen. I pre-activated the paints with a spray bottle, and as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I mixed up a beautiful and misty Payne's Gray from Ultramarine Blue and Burnt Umber. It diffused really prettily, nice granulation, but it doesn't split into like brown and then blue, so the mix stayed well mixed. The paints reactivate quickly and readily and release a decent amount of color for a background wash. These really diffused out. Maybe they have a lot of oxgall, so I ended up doing several layers on the background. In fact, they diffused more than I wanted, so I let it dry, reread it with water to diffuse a more saturated mix into, and it worked really well. These remind me of my first time using the older PR tube set, so while I'm leaning towards these are nice, I'm not necessarily seeing the improvements they promise. The old set was good too. Ultramarine Blue is very finely milled and doesn't granulate super noticeably. I also have a link in my show notes to the bird reference that I'm using for this. So far, these are easy to paint with. I definitely like painting with these better than my experience with Supervision tube watercolors. It's easy to forget that I'm doing this as a field test, which is a good sign, but no different than my first experience with Paul Rubens Tubens. I really enjoyed painting with those as well, and I love the color selection. These paints on Arches handle quite well. I do have 100% cotton rag Paul Rubens paper, and I probably should have thought to do it on that, but I'd forgotten at the time. I did kind of end up floundering on the skin, but I think that's really more on my part. I know what I want to do with it, and I'm just having a hard time with the manual dexterity thanks to my Sjogren's, so I kind of ended up overworking it. In the end, it probably doesn't matter. It will look better when I add the hair. These paints work really well on cotton rag. They get locked in and you can easily glaze over them. It's weird that although this is a 24 color palette, I feel a bit limited. I'm not necessarily missing the lack of a phthalo blue, but I am missing a mixed red violet. I can mix my own, but it never works out quite as nicely for me, and that's something I like about Mei Ling and their other PR tube sets. I don't really need a Naples yellow, and the two yellows included are already very similar. Neither looks particularly cool or warm. Same goes for Indigo and Prussian Blue. They're almost identical, and two of the three cool reds are also very close in color. So it feels like maybe they didn't make the best color selections for this set. You guys are going to see with the green jumpsuit though that I really struggle to build up color saturation and color intensity to the degree that I want. And it might be the fact that there's some pretty much duplicate colors in this set, and I just don't have access to certain colors that would have worked better as shading colors, or maybe it was a fluke in the Arches paper that I'm using, although I don't really think so. Maybe it was the weather outside. Maybe it was some of the optical brighteners that they may have included in these paints, but I really wasn't able to get the green quite as saturated as I'd really wanted to. I wasn't really able to build up the fabric to the degree that I would have liked to. Now, this is just a field test. This was sped up by 8x and then sped up by 8x again. So I am not good at computing that kind of math. You guys might be better than I am, but obviously this is severely time-lapse. It's really just meant to give you guys an idea of how these paints handle in a watercolor painting situation, the kind of watercolor painting that I do on the regular, in order to give them the fairest chance possible and to give me a little bit more information about how these paints handle and be able to talk to you guys about it in a way that's going to be useful for you guys. If you paint differently than I do, if you paint a different subject matter, if you handle your paints very differently, I do hope that while this field test isn't going to be one for one for you, we all paint differently, it is going to provide you guys with some real world examples of how I handle these paints and how these paints handle, and hopefully it'll be able to give you guys the information that you need to be able to decide if this palette is a good fit for you or not. As I mentioned earlier, I still really like the older Paul Rubens tubes. I still really like the older Paul Rubens half pans, and these are fine. These are not worse than those necessarily. I don't like the color selection as much. I feel like the colors are kind of limited in what they can do, but they're still high quality paints, and I do still enjoy painting with them. I would just recommend the older tube sets, particularly the ballerina set, which I love, over this set if you're going to buy Paul Rubens. Now, Obviously, Paul Rubens is not the only paint brand on the market. You guys have lots of options. I have reviewed lots of paints here on the channel, but because they're coming from China and because they're kind of newer on the US market, they're often more affordably priced and they frequently go on sale. That said, you can't really find them open stock here. So if you need to replace certain colors, you may be kind of out of luck for that. So that lack of accessibility might be a reason to start with these paints and then move away from these paints as your watercolor needs change over time. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later on, but I purchased these paints out of pocket on Amazon, like on Black Friday or Prime Day, using funds from my Patreon. This set was not sent to me. I sought out this set and I purchased this set of my own volition because I've had good experience with Paul Rubens watercolors in the past. That's another note. I have experience with Paul Rubens watercolors. I've tried out several of their palettes and I've liked several of their palettes, and I will probably continue to buy and try Paul Rubens paints because I think they're really pretty good for what they are. Not every palette is for everyone, and hopefully the information that I'm providing for you guys will let you guys know if this palette is for you. But to the very best of my ability, I was as unbiased as I could be, or I disclosed my biases when necessary. This product was purchased, so this is a review for consumers of my own volition, and I don't have any sort of working relationship with Paul Rubens whatsoever, to my knowledge. Maybe I missed something along the way. Maybe they've tried to contact me. I don't know, but we don't have that kind of relationship. I don't have a contact at Paul Rubens who reaches out to me anytime there's something new to ask me if I want to review it. I seek these things out. I follow them on AliExpress. I follow them on Amazon, and I purchase them of my own accord. So you guys can see I was having some trouble building up the kind of saturation that I wanted with her pants and with her gloves and her hat, but I really liked how the agouti fur turned out on her collar, her cuffs, and her boots. I hate to admit this, but I was referencing both my pet rat Basil and squirrels for that kind of colorway, and I hate to mention that because obviously if she's wearing it, somebody had to pass away for it, so I don't know if I can call it a little homage. So I also tried an interesting technique that I've seen around where you use white gouache in a diluted fashion. So I wet down the background and it didn't reactivate, which I really appreciate. And then I splattered some white gouache onto it to see it diffuse. This set does not come with a white, which I appreciate because honestly, white watercolors are always such a waste. I would just recommend you get gouache. Gouache is an opaque watercolor anyway. It's going to have more pigment. It's going to have more opacity. It's going to work out better for you guys. So I'm glad they didn't waste the space with a white gouache, but I really could have gone my entire life without that Naples yellow, and I love Naples yellow. Paul Rubens G4 paints are supposedly better than the older tubes because they contain more single pigments. They have the highest quality paints they've produced to date, and they don't really provide any information about this. Like, is it better gum arabic, better binders, better pigment sources? They don't really go into this. All in all, though, these are fine. They work well as watercolors. There isn't really anything wrong with them as a product, but as an improvement on an existing line in terms of how they handle for the field test, I think I prefer the older Paul Rubens tubes to this particular palette. I'm not really satisfied with this answer though, so I wanted to do a little digging and see what other artists think. There are a few pigment matches between the two sets, but they don't line up based on hue number, but they do on name. I assume hue number, maybe not series number, would correspond across lines when the pigments remain the same to make it easier to compare paints. So we do have some. We have Lemon Yellow, PY3, became more light fast and more permanent. Cadmium Red Light, PR108, is more light fast than original Cadmium Red. Venetian Red, PR101, and Venetian Red Ochre are likely similar colors. Venetian Red is opaque and Venetian Red Ochre is transparent. Venetian Red Ochre supposedly exhibits less purplish undertones. In the older set, Indian Red, Cypress Burnt Umber, and Venetian Red Ochre are all expressions of the same pigment, PR101. Two are transparent, one is semi-transparent. These are all single pigment. Between the older tubes and the newer tubes, there's a lot that changes between the colors, and there's a lot of opacity changes, which makes me wonder if maybe these granulate a little bit differently. None of the ones with multiple pigments appear to be duplicated between the two sets, so that seems like something that they might have changed. And I checked several different sites. I checked their English website, and the G4 watercolors are not on their site. I checked the Chinese website, and the G4 paints aren't on the Chinese site either. I couldn't find the information I was looking for, so I sought other reviews because I wanted to know how G4 is substantially better or different from the older tubes, and I thought maybe somebody else had figured this out. None of these reviews seem to do head-to-head comparison between the two lines, so I guess it's good that I did. In fact, many of these reviews had no prior experience with Paul Rubens watercolors at all. Substantial information on how the two lines differ isn't available from Paul Rubens at the time of this review. For these types of reviews, I can't help but think, would you not have purchased this and reviewed it of your own volition if it hadn't been sent to you? Having done some work with brands myself, many want to have final say over what is published, and many in contact after I disclose that I intend to do a fair review and test the product fully. I also disclosed at the top of my reviews when I purchased something versus when it was sent to me, and many of the reviews that I found disclose that information at the very end. As a reviewer, I find this frustrating and somewhat dishonest to readers. Now, I linked the other reviews that I found down in the description. This is not necessarily a recommendation, and many of these reviewers were sent these paints by Paul Rubens, and the information they have, other than what they found through swatching, is just them citing what Paul Rubens told them rather than doing any further digging for themselves. So that would be The Buzzed Artist, Art Alchemy Lab, Art Inside of Life, Miranda Below, and Doodle Wash in terms of where I found additional reviews. I just received a correction. So actually, we were wrong about the number of single pigments, okay? There are 18 in the G4 set. There are 19 single pigments in the old set. So the old set, you know, the set that this is supposedly improving upon by having more single pigment paints in it, the old set has one more single pigment paint than this set has. I feel like that's like a little bit of a mic drop moment right there. What are the pros and cons of the Paul Rubens G4 watercolors, Generation 4? So we're gonna start with the pros. These perform quite well. They can take rewetting and don't just go all over the place. They don't easily reactivate, so you can do lots of layers and adjustments. They diffuse readily into wet washes, and you get these really beautiful misty atmospheric effects. They handle beautifully on cotton rag paper like arches. A little goes a long way. I didn't lose all that much paint to evaporation, and I didn't eat through the paint the way I thought I would, and the way I do with many student grade watercolors. So what are the cons? Well, y'all already know where I stand with this. These claim to be an improvement over the older tubes. I didn't necessarily see a big enough difference, and I prefer the older tube sets to the colors in this set. So if you already have Paul Rubens tubes, I wouldn't recommend these because you don't really need them. And the colors can mix a bit muddy, and it can be challenging to layer effectively and build up color. I think this has to do with how finely milled these colors are though, so your mileage may vary. What is my verdict on the Paul Rubens G4 tubins? In general, I really like Paul Rubens watercolors. I've purchased every set I've reviewed for y'all over the years out of funds raised from Patreon. I have never received a set sent care of, so these opinions are uninfluenced by outside sources. I like their half pans. I like their travel set. I like their original tubes. I like their student grade Meliang pigments. In general, I think Paul Rubens produces high quality watercolor paints for people interested in watercolor, regardless of your budget and your skill level. If you already have the older tube sets, you do not need the G4 tubes. In fact, the G4 watercolors I reviewed, the tubes and the half pans, have left me underwhelmed. I don't see how they differ significantly from the older sets, and I've done the head-to-head comparisons to try and find out. So if you already have Paul Rubens half pans or tubes, you can safely skip the G4 palettes, at least in my opinion. So if you've been having FOMO over these watercolors, fear not, you are missing nothing. You already probably have better Paul Rubens watercolors. And if you're looking to buy Paul Rubens watercolors, in my opinion, skip these, get the older sets. The older half pans, I think those are a better set. The Mei Yang pigments, I think those are a great student grade option, especially compared to their Kai Mei set. And the tubes, I really like their older tube set. I have the Dancer set. It was a Christmas present, and I really like that set. So if you do want to buy Paul Rubens watercolors, you can save a little money and get great watercolors by getting the slightly older sets. So we talked a lot about Paul Rubens. We set them up into half pans, let them dry, and tested out how well they reconstitute. We did a whole lot of swatching, although not as much swatching as we did when we compared the Kai Mei and the G4 half pan. But here are our initial from wet and then from dry swatches to test how they reconstitute. Then we have our swatches comparing G4 half pans against G4 tubes. And then we have our swatches comparing the older PR tubes against the G4 tubes. And then I even did a field test on Arch's cotton rag watercolor paper. Not only that, but we did do our wet into wet test to give us an idea of how this would end up going. So we did a whole lot of testing, and in the end, I didn't really feel like this newest generation of Paul Rubens tubes was such a big improvement over the older tubes. That said, I really like the older tubes. I think the older tubes are a great product. They're a joy to paint with, and I particularly like the color palette that the older tubes have as compared to this set here. And keep in mind that my older tube set is like the ballet dancer set. It was given to me as a Christmas present, so it might have specific colors geared toward that, but I think it is a really lovely palette. Both sets are a joy to paint with, and I did find that some of the colors in the newer set were just a little too close to each other, taking up space that could have been, used for other colors that might have added a little bit more mixability and life to this palette. So, sometimes I love reviews where I really, really love the product and I think it's really worth your money and that I think you guys are gonna love it. And then sometimes I love doing reviews where I get to tell you guys it's a good product, but what you might already have, if you have the older Paul Rubens stuff, you're fine, you're good, you're golden, that will make you happy, your money was well spent. And these tubes, while they are decent quality artist watercolors and worth the price, are not better than those tubes, and those tubes might even be cheaper than these tubes. And of course, Editing Becca is gonna put up side-by-side scrolls to show the older tubes and the newer tubes on Amazon to give you guys an idea of the prices. So comparative reviews like this are only made possible thanks to the generosity of my patrons on Patreon. Their support is what enables me to purchase the supplies that I need to be able to do these kind of reviews. I don't see any outside sponsorships. You don't see me taking ads from Skillshare. You don't see me trying to shill BetterHelp, not that I ever would because they are awful. You don't see me selling meal subscription services. All of the income generated from YouTube either comes from AdSense, and you don't have to watch the ads for my sake, sweetheart, or from Patreon. So they're the reason I'm able to offer these kind of reviews, and I truly appreciate their support so much. You can check out their awesome names right here. So thank you guys so much for joining me today. I hope hope this review was helpful, useful, and informative. And hopefully by helping you guys buy art supplies that you will truly love, I will help you guys make art a habit, because that's what we're all about here. Whether I am sharing comic tutorials or drawing tutorials or watercolor tutorials or art supply reviews, or we're easily influenced, I am here to help you spend your money wisely on supplies that you will truly love, and hopefully I'm here to indoctrinate you into drawing comics, because that is my end true goal. Speaking of comics, if you guys would like to check out more of my work, I have a watercolor webcomic you guys can read at 7inchcare.com. And if you are a fan of books, and if you're watching this channel, let's be real, you're probably a fan of books. You can order copies of Volume 1 and Volume 2 from the Natto shop at nattosoup.com/shop. So if you are a fan of cottagecore or hobbitcore, I think you will really enjoy it. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. I look forward to seeing you guys again really soon. Bye, guys!